Come join Melissa and her guests on the Chats from the Blog Cabin podcast. From North Carolina, this podcast will have you feeling like you've known these folks for years. Listen in as they chat about life, culture, current events, and more, all with a special Southern flair. Curl up with your favorite beverage and get ready to be entertained. Tune in now for a unique experience that's fun and insightful.
Welcome back to another episode of Chats from the Blog Cabin, the show where I virtually invite people into the Blog Cabin to chat about life. And today we have a repeat guest, and I'm so excited because she wrote the book Your Roots Cast a Shadow, and she came on last time to talk about her book. But this time we're going to talk about the roots part, because right now what's going on in the world is either we don't know, we don't have a sense of where we're from, or we forget or we deny where we're from. So Carolyn, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
So refresh the viewers and the listeners of who you are and everything.
So, Caroline Topperman, I'm a writer, and as you said, my book came out a handful of months ago now, Your Roots Cast a Shadow. I'm also a book coach, and I co-own a small press, actually. But one of my big passions is family histories, or our family histories and stories, and like those stories that connect us and help us make sense of the world. And I actually also, which I'm sort of restarting now, run a magazine on Medium called Migrations Review, where I ask people to submit their stories and like the stories about identity and how their place in the world.
Oh, I'd love that. And I might be submitting a story for you.
Please do.
So I remember when we did our interview, you talked about living and following and finding your parents and your grandparents through and going back and through the war and what they went through and going to Poland and everything else, and how it was really eye-opening for you when you went into like a Jewish store in Poland and there was hardly any Jewish stores there and everything, and how that was like eye-opening for you. So talk about that experience.
So in 2013, my husband and I sold almost everything we owned, and everything else went into a big storage locker. We were living in Vancouver, Canada at the time, and we moved to Warsaw, to Poland, just sort of on a whim. It wasn't initially intended to find family, but once I landed, I found all these places that I didn't know, like I'd been there before, but that I didn't realize, that we randomly moved around the corner from where my parents got married, and my cousin, like half my family got married. And then my family lived across the street randomly from where we lived. And then we found the place where my dad lived and where my mom went to school. All these places suddenly started coming up. And that was what you're talking about, was that we arrived in November of 2013. And I realized that the menorah that I had packed was in a box somewhere in the middle of the ocean, and the holidays were coming up, and I thought, where do you find a menorah in a predominantly now Catholic country? And so the only place was in the little store beneath the synagogue, or next to the synagogue. But it was, that was a really funny adventure, actually, having to find that. And there was just seeing how much of that part of Poland, which was so prominent before the war, how decimated it was. But actually, since we talked, I just came back from Poland 2 weeks ago.
Wow.
Yeah. And I was at an exhibit of what happened post-war, sort of 1945 on. And I didn't know this, but after the war, there were actually quite a few Jews left in Poland. And interestingly enough, they sort of left in groups due to various reasons. And there was a fact there. I can't prove this as a yes or no. I'm just going to go by what I saw at the museum. But they said that it had all these next exoduses, had they not happened, there would have been about 400,000 Jews in Poland right now.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's just I thought that was a really interesting fact. And right now there are some, like maybe 15,000. So that's a huge difference.
Yeah, that's a huge difference. Why do you think there was such a mass exodus, like you said, in certain dribs and drabs of the Jewish people leaving Poland? Do you think it's because they wanted to leave behind the bad memories of the war, or what?
Some of it, yes. Some of it for sure, because they weren't really wanted there. So they couldn't find community. The communities were still being shunned. There were still like exterminations happening, basically. Not the war ones, but smaller towns didn't want them. The next biggest one, and I write about this in my book, is 1968. It was about 25,000 that left at that time. And that was because the government was communist, and communism doesn't like any religion. So they basically spoke out against the Jews, and my grandfather was kicked out of the government officially, and my uncle spent 1.5 years in jail. So that wasn't uncommon, that story. And so that's when a lot left as well. And it was just much harder. Life became really hard and uncomfortable.
Yeah. I can imagine. And it's kind of similar. And the reason why you're coming back on is because I feel like it's kind of a similar situation of what's happening in the world right now too. Because of, the immigrants, especially if you're in Canada, but in America, the immigrants, especially the brown skinned immigrants, are being like targeted, and they can say all they want that they're not targeting them, but they are targeting them after seeing multiple things. So how did your parents survive this? How did your grandparents survive this?
I mean, there are a lot of PTSD in the family, I would say. It wasn't easy. Like my grandparents, we'll talk about my maternal grandparents, because that's the Jewish side of my family. I mean, they had just survived a war where they had to flee, and they were a day or two ahead of the Nazis as they were fleeing east into Soviet territory. And they came back already scarred after a few years away. Then they came back to find that their families had been decimated. Part of why I was in Poland was actually to go to the Historical Institute to talk to the genealogists to see if I could find information about my great-grandparents. And so, they didn't know what really happened to them. They knew 3/4 of my mother's family gone, for example, and they couldn't come back to where their homes were either, because there were already other people living there who didn't want to let them in. So they had to restart their lives. And this is 1944. And then 20 years later, they're getting kicked out again, and they're having to leave. So I don't know, in those 20 years, it's a long time, but it's also, we know how time flies. It's also not that long a time. So they basically had to just pick up everything and go again. This is just a little aside, but for my grandparents in particular, because my grandfather was in the government, part of the government, it's not that they got paid well, but they had privileges, but those privileges were taken away. So they didn't have money really to leave. And so for them, it was just restarting their lives again until they could, and they lived in Sweden, and then they spent some time in Spain, and then finally found their home in Germany. But it was just restart. And my parents, at the time in 1968, while this was happening, my dad had gone to work in Baghdad. He was a geotechnical engineer at the time, and my mom was studying painting in Paris, and they joined up, and then they went back to Paris, and again had to restart everything and learn new languages. And then Sweden, same thing. And it's not just restarting there are no other Polish speaking countries really, so they had to learn these languages. And then finally when they came to Canada, and it was just restart. And I think you go into this just mode of one step after the other, get it done, keep going. And that's how I think that's a really good question. And I think that's all they could do.
Yeah, basically just kind of hold off on their emotions, trying not to show their emotions each time, because if they did, they would break. Correct?
I know it wasn't easy. I was doing interviews with my dad up until just before he died last year. And it was really hard to get him to go deeper than just facts of what it was. And I think, I have some letters that my mom had written to her parents, but again, they're very, like, when my parents were going from Paris to Sweden, it wasn't, I'm afraid I have to restart. Oh, I'm going to have to look for a job or, take extra schooling. It was more my mom going, okay, so we need winter coats and we need this. And it was just very practical, this is what I need to make it through, to survive. This is where the apartment's going to be. This is what we're going to do. So I think, I think you're right.
I mean, it just blows my mind that happened in Germany. And yet people say it didn't exist. It was all a hoax, in which, it did exist. And two is people are not learning from that. It's so far out of their little area, their space, that they don't even think that, that's not happening right now. But this is how it started.
It started with the gaslighting, and then the made up stories, and then all of that, and just a little bit, and it's slow, and nobody really realizes it. And I say this at some point, I say this all the time, but it's the people who are loud and very vocal about what they want. I know, hate is always going to be there. Mm-hmm. That's something we know. That's something you can steel yourself against. But I think that it's the people who stay quiet that scare me, because I don't really know what they're thinking. And I don't even know if they're going to stand up and say anything or do anything, or if they're just going to be quiet. And then suddenly it's too late.
Yep. It's too late. Now I want to ask you, as an observer in Canada, what do you see? Because a lot of times, U.S. media doesn't cover the full story. And so it's like, I see such a trend on TikTok, or like, if you're from another country and you can see this video, please comment and tell me what you think, what you're seeing in your country about what's going on in America.
So Canada being close to the States, we get a lot of your news, although it's interesting because a number of years ago, Canada and the big tech companies had a falling out. And for a long time, like up until now, if you post something, for example, on any of the Meta sites, we don't get that information. We don't get those news stories, which is really interesting. But, what's happening right now, this incredible divide, and it's like, I think that there is right now, I'll go big to small, but I think there's a new world order starting to happen. And it really, like, one of the kickoffs, I think, was when Russia invaded Ukraine. And that was a big kickoff of this new shift of powers. And I think in the last, I don't know, since your last elections, that has continued. And I think on a smaller scale, it's actually also now happening within the United States, that there's a shift in power, there's a shift in thinking, the people whose voices we don't want are the really loud voices. And I think it's sort of on both sides, though, both political sides. And I think it's those middle voices that we really should have, that should be in control, or not. And I think that's very unfortunate. And until those voices can sort of come together and be the loudest, this shift is going to keep happening. I don't know if this was a podcast or something, I can't remember, but I was talking with my husband about it, and we were seeing how what's happened now since, like, the Cold War ended, basically, in these last few years, where most of us are now, this is kind of my normal, not actually the world normal. This was a very quiet period of time in the world. And I think we're going back to normal. That's kind of scary, because I don't want that normal.
Me neither. But what I do like in this country, that what's happening is that people are standing up and protesting, and they're doing it in such a way that they're getting people's attention, and they're starting to call things. And you have these, I don't know if it's because social media is sharing more about what stuff. Can you imagine if social media was around during the Holocaust?
Can you
imagine? It probably would have not gone as far as it did.
No, probably not.
Probably within, I'd say 6 months, it was shut down.
Yeah, probably. I think, and it's funny, we had this conversation with friends recently too about, I don't know if I should go out for the protest. I don't know. Does it matter? And I was trying to say that, yes, it matters. It matters so much, because by going out and speaking out, you're actually showing other people that there are other people thinking the same way. And also, you're right. And maybe like the one protest won't really do anything, but if there are constant protests, this is a constant thing that's building and building and building, at some point, like, your government may be ignoring the protests, but what happens is other governments around the world are not ignoring those protests, and they start reporting on it. And then that's how that pressure builds. I think Georgia, I think, has had protests like weekly, daily, or something, with hundreds of thousands of people that come out. But a few of the protests, at least, that you are having in the US, we've in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, probably other Canadian cities, we've had protests at the same time, sort of in sympathy with yours. And so I think that winds up happening too. That's 100% social media. But if you're having a protest in the States, there's a good chance, like one of those big national ones, there's a good chance there's that same protest being echoed in Canada and in European countries as well.
Yeah, for sure. And that brings me to the question about, we're all immigrants. We've all immigrated from someplace. And I just don't understand why people can't realize that our countries are basically made from immigrants, and they were built by immigrants. And why now all of a sudden immigrants are not welcome? That's what really bothers me. And I know you dug into a lot of that when you talked about your parents moving around and your grandparents moving around, so how did they finally get comfortable and settle in Canada and be able to say, this is our country, this is where we're going to stay?
So, I know for my parents, a big part of it was really joining their communities where we lived and being part of the community and not shutting it out. And they didn't, none of our countries are perfect. Let's just say that, right? They're like, no country is 100% perfect. There are things we hate about countries, love about countries. It's all good. But I think it was just really about about contributing to society, being part of society. And I'm not saying, I really don't want to use the word assimilation, because they didn't. They retained their cultures. We retained our language, all of that. But it was also about accepting where we came from. And I don't want anyone to take this the wrong way, because I think, because then we get into this whole ugly conversation about assimilation and all of that. And I think that, that's not what I'm saying. Just want to preface. But I think, it really is that. It really is that, they made friends with people. Our stories connect us. I can tell you a story, and I will be willing to bet that if you dig around, you'll be like, oh, I understand that. I actually did an interview with this author last week, and she has a completely different background than mine, completely different experiences. And yet there were so many things that I could pinpoint and be like, yes, I totally understand that. I understand why your parents did that, or why you thought this way because of me. And I think what winds up happening is we start to do so much of this them and us, and that's everybody. And I think that's everybody doing it. And what happens is then we lose those very integral connections.
Yeah.
And when we start closing ourselves off, whoever we are, that's when all those problems start.
Yep. And I love the way you said you were interviewing an author, and you said that, you were like, yes, that's me too. Oh, yes, I'm similar. It's when we sit down and have conversations, instead of yelling at each other and trying to get our point across, at doing listening, we're going to find out that we're a lot similar than we think we are. And then we're not so different. And that we all have the same basic beliefs. We all want a nice home to live in. We all want food on our table. We want our family to be happy. Basically, that's our core values right there.
Yeah.
And we want to lead with love. But a lot of times hate outshines the love. And we've got to stop that out, because we're so stuck on trying to get our point across and trying to get people to think the way we want them to think, or the way we think people should think, like we think, all over the place. And when it's not true, everybody has a difference of opinions.
And also, that's where the social, the good and the bad of social media, right? That's where the social media comes up too, because we start living in sound bites, and we start living in snippets, and what's the latest trend that we can jump on, and what's the latest slogan that can be yelled all over social media. And then you wind up sort of closing yourself off to a lot of that, because it starts to become too emotional or whatever. And then those stories get lost immediately.
Yeah, for sure. I saw something the other day about a protest in LA, and somebody posted and said, well, tell us what happened before this happened, because it was a guy getting arrested. And he was like, he didn't believe the story, because he's like, he had to have investigated this. And at one point in time, I would have said the same thing, because I'm a daughter of a cop. So I kind of look at it through the cop's lens, because I know what kind of cop my dad was.
Yeah.
And so when when the woman's like, okay, well, you wanted to know what happened before that. And she showed the video. And they're like, absolutely nothing happened. He was just protesting peacefully. And because they didn't like what he was saying, they went and arrested him. And I'm like, that's one of our fundamental rights that we have to do. So at what point do we say we have to stand up for what we believe in and for what our freedoms are? Or at what point do we just bury our head in the sand and say, I can't do this anymore, la, 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 because because when we bury our head in the sands, that's when people start disappearing and when people start, like the Holocaust happened, because people didn't believe it was happening and people were burying their heads in the sand. Oh, they're not going to come after us. And they ended up coming after people.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, the ICE raids, we see those too. And that's happening. And I'm not comparing the two, but that's, people are burying oh, it won't happen. Oh, it's not so bad. Oh, but it is so bad.
Mm-hmm.
And it's never so bad at the beginning, and then it gets so bad and then you can't stop it. So I think absolutely. And then again, we get pitted against each other. And I think part of it too is that, it's just people don't take the time to really learn. They don't really take the time to, you said this at the very, very beginning about when we lose that connection with where we come from.
Uh-huh.
I think that's and who we are. And I think that's what happens a lot here, where we say, like in Canada, it's like, I'm French Canadian, States, Irish American, whatever, any of those terms. But we don't really understand what that means and where they come from. And even, this is really kind of funny, but my home where I live, it was, I think, because I actually did some research on it, because it was built in the 1800s. And I think it was an Irish farmer's cottage. And I mean, I live in the city, but I think it was like they came over from Ireland and then worked for the people in this part of the city. This is where these big old mansions were.
Mm-hmm.
My house is not. It's a little, this is how they lived, and there are probably quite a few people living in this tiny, like really, really, really small place.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but you forget about that, and you forget what people went through to come over or to do, or to how they had to restart their lives. And we just sort of take that for granted too.
Yep, for sure. We need to take a brief commercial break, but we'll be right back.
In a world full of chaos, she chose to anchor her story in hope. Through storms and silence, she found strength, and now she's inviting you to do the same. This isn't just a book, it's a lifeline. For every woman who's ever felt unseen, your healing begins here, anchored in hope, available now.
And we are back. And we just talked about immigration and immigrants. I don't know if I told you this on our last, when we were together last time, but my great grandmother is actually from Canada. She actually was born and raised there. I don't know how I wish I had gotten that story from my dad of how they met, because my grandfather was originally from Michigan and they ended up in Massachusetts. So explain that to me. I just don't get it. But being able to trace on both sides of my family back to immigrants is really cool, because, like I said, my great grandmother, my dad's grandmother was from Canada, but my husband's side, my girls are first generation Mexican Americans. And so to be able to see how far they've grown and how far they've come in this world, where my husband came here when he was, I think, 17 years old. We met when we were like 24, 25. And he has a 6th grade education, but such a mechanical brain. Oh my gosh, he can fix anything, and he can look at a picture and make anything. I could just show him a picture and he can build it. I mean, literally. But to see that, and to see now he has a daughter who was a PhD candidate, one owns her own home, and the other one, for that, the immigrants, people don't see that type of thing for immigrants. They see them as freeloaders. And I think that's very important, a distinction to make. They're not freeloaders. They're not getting this government assistance. Even everywhere. I mean, even my dad, when he was growing up, he was very poor. I mean, his mom and dad would get back long enough to make a baby, and then he would beat her, and then they would split up. And so 8 kids later, she finally left him. I mean, it took 8 kids. And literally, I think my mom said during that period of time, I think there was a year where she wasn't pregnant. Yeah. So my dad came and he was the oldest of 8. And he came from a very poor background, but he learned his roots and learned how to appreciate things from his grandmother and his grandfather, because he moved in with them, and that's were his role models. So it's important to point out that, yeah, there may be some people that are cheating the system, but more often than not, it's not the immigrants cheating the system. It's other people that don't want to call out. So yeah, continue.
Yeah, no. Sorry, I'm just like all the thoughts. One though, if I think we could find your great grandmother, because there are records. There are records in Canada, and the first thing actually the genealogist told me was to try to find birth records, marriage, or death certificates, and those are the 3 that you can work off of really well when you're trying to find people. But I think yes, there are people who come into our countries. I'll pull Canada into this too, that are not here for good and that are here to try to just live off the system. Sure, of course. But there are humans in this world, and there are all kinds of humans. But I think your average person who fought to come to this country in one way or another is here to contribute. And I will put both of our countries, on the line for this one. I can tell you, my parents showed up with $100, 2 suitcases, a dog, and me. And yes, we had a home we rented, but then we bought homes, and my parents worked, and they worked extremely hard. They, just to get us on some even footing with the community where we lived in. And, I was actually made fun of through elementary school. I was made fun of for my clothing because we shopped in basement bargain stores, and my parents sent me to an elementary school that was in a better part of town, I guess. So yeah, I got made fun of, but I never knew my parents not to work, not to fight, not to constantly push. You're not moving to another country to freeload. That's sort of ridiculous that you would do that. You're not moving to a different country to just kick back. And or you have so much money that you can, but then you're still contributing because you're spending. But that's a different, that's a completely different thing. Most people, when they're coming for a better life. And a better life means that's something you're working for, right?
For sure. Now, you said that you've been playing a lot with the question, what happens to our sense of self if we don't know where we came from? But I also want to add a little caveat to this, or when we deny where we came from.
Yeah.
Because that, right now, I see that playing hugely in the world, is we're denying where we came from. We're trying to forget about our past or how we were brought up or the people that came before us, and we kind of deny that. So how do we do that?
Yeah, you know what? This is like the $1 million question. I think when we sort of deny that or forget or don't know, you're right. When we don't know, I think we're trying to find it. When we are actively denying it, I think we're actually doing ourselves and everybody around us a big disservice, because we are, quote unquote, killing the stories. And those are like we said, those are the stories that connect us. Those are the stories that allow us to see each other as human beings. And I think that at that point, we can't do that. If you're constantly living a lie, then how can you make a proper connection with someone? How can you move forward if it's always a lie? It's like you just get buried under this. So I think that that's something we owe each other to sit down and really sort of decide what really matters. Just forget the social media, forget all the slogans, forget all the things the governments are saying, and just to sit down and decide for ourselves what really matters. And that's how you have to move forward.
Yeah, because I think a lot of what's happening now in the world is people are denying where they came from. They're trying to start out fresh. They're trying to erase their family history. Case in point, I really am kind of, I don't want to say disappointed, but with knowing that I've read Hillbilly Elegy and seeing where he came from and now seeing what he's doing, it's hard. It's hard to compensate. he knew everything, that he knew the hard things. He knew, I mean, if anybody, his family lived off of welfare. His family did all this stuff, because they were very poor, and they were not all like mentally all there either. But yet still, they're still pointing out that this is not the people that are doing this. This is other types of people, instead of saying, you know what, this is my family history. Let me learn from it, and let me learn to appreciate the people that are around that are working hard and doing the hard things.
Yeah, well, I mean, you'd think he'd be the one standing up for all the immigrants and everybody who's just trying to make it better and do better. But no, right? It's just, I have money now and I have the status or whatever. I have no idea what goes through that man's mind, let me just like tamp down on all of it. But no. And, it's interesting too. Sometimes, like all of every city has these areas where a lot of like new immigrants come and settle in the area. And it's sort of like that pass-through place. But a lot of the time when you see that, those are the places that have the best community, because everybody's sort of in it together at that point and you're not being divided up. And I would say Toronto, some parts of Toronto where I'm right now, the downtown core are really interesting in that way too, because there are these like little communities, but they're very, at least where I am, they're very mixed. The economics are very mixed. And so where I live, just sort of kitty corner to me, there used to be a rooming house. And I remember, and it was, it was pretty quiet. It was a group of men that lived there. And I remember my neighbor saying something to me when I first moved onto the street, and she goes, yeah, they're a little weird, but there are men. And I was like, oh, okay, great. Nothing ever happened since moved. It was like, but it was like sort of the community knew, everybody knew, and everybody just like, whatever happened, you were kind of there for them. It was what it was. And I think that was kind of beautiful. I don't know, that always sort of stayed with me because they weren't, it's not exactly immigrants, but it was the same kind of thing. It was this group that maybe needed extra assistance.
Yeah.
And one of them kept asking me to marry him. So, it was great.
That was like, marry me. That's really cool. Yeah. But I think it's important that we sit down and listen to the stories though, and talk. And like you said, it was really great when one kept asking you to marry him, because it helped your self-confidence. There was no harm meaning by it, So where did the world turn that all of a sudden it's so cynical and they're so worried about what everybody else has instead of worrying about what they can do in their own little corner of the world?
The questions, I don't know. I think it's when we stop I think it's when we have that feeling that I'm touching on something you said earlier, where we have that feeling that we have to impose all of our views on other people, and then we create the other. And I saw this happening when we first moved to Poland. The whole idea behind why I decided to write this book and all of that, I saw that it started to become this idea that it was like, country, family, and these were the people standing up. But that meant that if you weren't like the traditional family, you don't count, but not so much that you don't count, you shouldn't even exist.
Yeah.
And what happens is that, again, there weren't enough voices speaking out against this. And you know what? You may like things, you may not like things, but it's sort of not your problem and none of your business. And it's when we start to do that, when we stop listening and seeing people as human beings. And I think that's where we start really going wrong. It's that idea that my values are better than yours.
Yeah, for sure. Now, what did you learn when you were doing the research for your book, Your Roots Cast a Shadow, about the resilience of your family? Because your family went through going back, I honestly cannot trace anyone back to what happened in Germany. But, you even talked about how you found during the time, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, your grandfather's journal?
Yes and yes. Yeah. I have one grandfather's more journal, 38 pages. Other grandfather wrote an unpublished book about.
Yeah, but you found it when you were going through the research. You found it in some museum, correct?
Well, that one, yes. So right now it's I still don't know how it got sent out, but it must have hit. Somebody must have submitted it to a Holocaust museum in Europe, but all of these museums and places, they're all interconnected.
Mhm.
And so I actually found it at Stanford at the Hoover Institute in their archives. And I spoke with the archivist, and she was particularly interested in it because she was studying the Jews who survived the Holocaust in places like Uzbekistan and in that region. And so that was her, I don't know, that was like her specialty or something. And so, yeah.
So how did that make you feel once you started reading the stories, even though it was kind of matter of fact, the journal was very matter of fact, how did that make you feel?
I mean, it was a whole connection to a world I didn't know, and things that, unfortunately my grandparents were so scarred, but that they didn't really talk about this. And maybe I was too young for some of these stories too.
Uh-huh.
But the fact that all the things that they fought and did and learned from and tried, like that's my maternal grandfather. He ran an underground press in the 1930s and it was Poland. Now it's Ukraine, but he could have been sent to a camp easily because there were already concentration camps in the 30s. They were just not the death camps that we know, but they were more for political prisoners. He could have been sent to one easily. He could have been sent to, he could have been killed, or just jailed. I mean, any number of things could have happened, but nope, he was running this underground press to freedom of speech, to try to speak out and make connections and just finding that out and finding out little bits and pieces about his parents and where they were from and what their choices were. And my grandmother too, because he doesn't write as much about her, but the fact that she went with him and stayed with him. And then she fled with him too. And all of those things, it really it showed me that they were, not that I didn't know, but they were my grandparents when I knew them. And now when I read the book, they became human beings with ideas and passions and wants as well. So, and they became, and three-dimensional too, because, he cheated and whatever else. And my grandmother was far from perfect too, but it made me sort of see what they went through. Like there was this passage that he writes about, I think it was in his book. It was either his book or my grandmother's interview, but where they're fleeing and they're basically packing themselves into cattle cars just to get out, to go, to get away. And at one point they had to shave their heads because they all had lice. And, they sold everything, any little bits of jewelry, trinkets my grandmother had managed to grab. And they sold all of that just to get some food. And those were like those gut punches for me that this is because I've only seen that in the movies, but my family went through that too.
I can't even imagine. First, let's talk about when you first found the journal, because that seems to be so surreal that you actually found something that you didn't even know existed. I mean, it'd be different if you were on the search looking for it and you're like, oh, I know it exists, let me go find it. But you didn't even know it exists. How did you stumble across it?
So we were cleaning out a storage locker, my dad's storage locker, and I had already started writing these little stories and ideas around this book. It wasn't in this format. And it was so my mother passed away like 30 years ago, and there were some of her boxes, and my dad had all these things, and I just never really looked at them. And it was in there, and he had several copies that were clearly printed out and with the spiral binding, that he gave to some of his friends and family. And this was my mother's copy, so there was a dedication to her. And it took me a while to read it, or to get my Polish to be good enough to read it, because there was no translations, and I could read Polish, but very slowly, definitely not even probably at an intermediate level back then. And so I had all of this stuff, and it felt like every page just uncovered something new and more information. And then I slowly turned to these letters, and I guess he had kept all the letters that my mother wrote, or almost all, I don't know, the letters that my mother wrote when she was away. And so it was just this really crazy way to start to piece together this history that no one talked about. Pretty clear. My parents did talk about it, but my grandparents, from an early age, it was pretty clear that this was like an off limits topic. So finding this written by him, and it, it's all type on a typewriter, and I, hit with his handwriting where he had to correct things or make a note or something. So, yeah.
I can't even imagine running across something like that. How much that must have meant to you.
Oh, it was definitely emotional. It's definitely, being kept properly in one of those boxes that doesn't let the environment wear it down. It's like, it's just one of those things.
So what made you, how did it get to finding it to getting into the museums?
So that happened before. I don't have a great answer to that, because I originally I was just Googling him to see if there was anything online about him. And that's when I found out, that's when I did find some articles about his termination from the government in US papers, actually. So I know it, even though this was happening in Poland, it was being reported on in the US. It was definitely a big thing. It was a big moment. And then I stumbled upon it, but I didn't really realize what it was. And I didn't really realize that this thing exists, that this hard copy of it existed. And I was reading it on a computer screen, but it was kind of weird because it wasn't very clear, and I could only get part of it. And then you have to order the rest of it. It was just it wasn't very easy to look at. And so I kind of didn't think about it. And then I found it and then made that connection.
I can't even imagine finding a written history like that. How much, I'm sure it gave you new appreciation for your grandparents and what they went through, and the whole thing of how your family were nomads until they finally settled in Canada, how that whole situation went through. I can't even imagine, felt.
Yeah, it was very emotional, definitely very emotional. And honestly, that was the first time that I learned a lot of these things. When I sat down to finally, like, I'm determined, I'm going to read this thing. It's going to, whatever. And I didn't know a lot of that. So I had to keep going to my dad to check. And then I had to do so much fact checking to see what was going on, really. And, because memory's fallible, we know. And so, but yeah, no, that was, and then I had to sit with maps. And then some of the places he talked about were, he mentioned them, he'd write them in Polish, because this whole thing is written in Polish, but really they are in Ukraine. So they were using, like, they were kind of Russian, and then some of the names have changed since then. Like when I was looking up places, and then borders have changed since then. And there was just so many changes that I was sitting there with like maps and history and books and just trying to piece it all together to make it make sense for myself. Like at one point I tried to trace their journey too. And it was this crazy long journey that they had to take around there, and then figure out what the area looked at. And thank goodness for Google Maps, where you can where you can do, or Google Street View, right, where you can go in and see it. But
so that was the catalyst for you moving to Poland, correct?
No, this came after. I know, it's so confusing. Even half the time I'm confused. I don't know what came first or second, like myself at this point. I had started becoming interested in this, of course, but and then I went to Poland. So right after my mom died, so 1995, my mother passed away. My dad takes my sister and me to Poland to say, hey, I want you to see your roots. I want you to know where you're from. And that, that was a long time ago. And that sparked a lot of this idea. And I actually sort of started to work on this back then, because I was interviewing my dad and we were talking about things, and I was picking his brain, and it just felt I had more urgency around it because my mother had died. And that was when I was in film school. So I kind of started writing it. I actually went and found those old screenplays now, and I think I did a pretty good job finding that information. And then, but I wasn't really mature enough to deal with this. And the whole project sort of died a little bit. And then in 2011, 2012, I went to Poland again, just with my husband, just to visit. He hadn't been back since he left. And we sort of just went to see it. And that sparked it again. And then when we moved there, I was like, no, I need to write this book. Because it was the marches and the protests that I started seeing, the scary ones. The scary people were getting a voice. And I thought, I need to write a book. And then within that time, this book fell in my lap. Yeah.
So it was meant to be, basically. You did the hard work and the research and interviewing your dad and doing all that with the idea of writing the book, but you didn't actually start until you felt like you were mature enough to be able to write it and give it the chance and the life and the world that you wanted it to have, instead of just, I hate to use this word, half-assing it and just kind of putting something out there.
Yeah, I would have it would have been half-assed, and it would have just been lost. I would have probably would have done something with it or not done something with it, and it would have just like fizzled. So yeah, I needed this time to mature myself.
And actually, in a way, though, you kind of, I don't want to say recreated, because recreate is not the right word, but you kind of were on your own journey, like your grandparents were, from all these different places that they lived to where they finally landed. You went on your own little journey of finding out who you were and finding out where you were the most comfortable at, and you had to be comfortable enough to be able to write the story.
Yeah, that's it. I think now I'm gonna steal that for
because it's like a parallel journey. You weren't quite on the same journey. You weren't escaping persecution, but you were trying to find your own place in the world like they were.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know what? 100%. I had to kind of find my place. I had to I had to find my story, my roots, my way, to be able to then connect to theirs.
And you appreciate it so much more because of the way that you did it, instead of it just being handed to you and told to you.
100%. Yeah, because when it gets, handed to you, like I laugh, there are those stories my dad told, and the like 50th time you'd hear that story, you'd be like, and like you could finish it, and then they change it up on you, and you're like, I think that's wrong, But this, is finding it from that other angle, and that's what it is. And I think, I suspect actually that it won't be all that different for your daughters too, as as they start. I know that they're connected, but as they get older, they'll connect even more to their roots and and where they're from, both from both sides of their parents to sort of see that, right? I think that that's really powerful. I think that that's actually really powerful too, that they're like, it's a mixed heritage.
Yep. And it's so funny that you would say that, because my oldest daughter, she's going to be 30 in September. She actually just messaged me the other day and said, Mama, are you ever going to write about immigration? Because I was so little when all this was going on with Daddy. I don't remember a lot. Are you ever going to write about it or address it? And I'm like, I hadn't thought about that, because they don't remember, because they remember certain things, but they don't remember the whole story. And they don't remember the first time we ever went to visit Mexico or anything like that. So part of a story that I now can tell them and actually write down, and maybe hopefully one day they'll find it. I'm going to hide it from them. No.
Yeah, but it's great, right? And then their first take on their roots in Mexico, like what was that like for them? Because, it was, I remember my first time going to Poland, and I remember how different it was, and how I had to find my connection there, because it was so different. It was such a culture shock for me going there. And so for them too, it must have been a big culture shock for them too. I mean, when you're little, it's easier, but still,
it was a culture shock.
Yeah, and you have to sort of understand that.
And even to the point that, my parents grew up in Massachusetts, and my girls have never been there. And I wanted them one day to just us take a girls trip and go up there and show them, okay, this is where Nana lived. This is where Grampy lived. They lived right down the road from each other. My mom moved in when she was 11. My dad was, I think, 14 at the time. They met, just instantly. My dad went off in the military. My mom started writing him because, as she said, that's just what you did back in those days.
And I think we forget that, like, we're talking about immigrants, and absolutely, but we forget too, like, the people who were, even though they weren't fresh immigrants, we'll say, they were several generations in, but the different lives they had. Like, if I look around even my neighborhood, like I said, I told you about this little house, but there are these like huge mansions in my neighborhood and each one has this like crazy history, because this area is where the Torontonians used to go on vacation. We're like 3 miles from downtown, but it was far back then, right? And and this is where they used to go because it was by the lake or whatever. And so each one of these has the story, and each one of these places, this is what I love about places. But that's the same thing. And I know I have a few friends in Pittsburgh, and you go to these tiny, these really weird narrow streets where the house is like almost right on the sidewalk, and there are these rows, and no two cars can't pass each other on the street. And the stories that are sitting there, I think, are incredible. And it's the same thing. So I've never been to Massachusetts myself, but I'm sure that it's the same there as well. That each street, the houses that have survived, 50, 60, 70 plus years, even though they have stories, there's a lot there. There's this foundation that's been built there.
It's so funny that you mentioned Pittsburgh, because 2 years ago we went to Pittsburgh. My youngest daughter and my oldest daughter was actually at a conference there, and she lives in California. So anytime she's on the East Coast, within driving distance, we go and see her. And one of my really close friends, she had told me that since my husband was Catholic and my girls were brought up Catholic, that they had a church there had the largest collection of relics, of Catholic relics, outside of the Vatican. It's the largest. So we're like, okay, we're going to go hunt it down. And you talk about narrow streets. Oh my gosh, there's that one street. And I see TikTok on it. And I shared it with my daughter the other day. And I was like, this is the street. She said it didn't look that scary when we were driving it. But literally, like, the streets were like that narrow. And you're going up these really steep inclines and these hills. And you're like, are we going to make it? Is the car going to roll back? Here's another car coming. And heaven forbid, if you're not in a small car and you're in an SUV, oh my gosh, I can't even imagine driving those streets. And I'm like, what the heck? And this church was like in a very, very poor community, but it was a beautiful church. But they had, like, you could tell that they had all these security stuff and everything. And they had the little museum across the street that was a house. And we were like, oh my gosh, just to be able to see that, though, and to embrace that culture and to see, it was amazing.
Yeah, that was like an experience we had near the Alhambra in Spain. And I was with my mom, and my mom would be the one who'd be like, let's just go down this random street. And we turned down this random street that to this day, I swear, it was like entering like a Fellini movie, old Italian movie. And there's this church, and we were like, let's go look. And it was this rough made brown heavy wooden door, and we walk in, and it was this tiny room, white walls with these dark brown pews that were again handmade, you could tell, but like all the icons there, it was statues, and they were all dressed in like gold spun clothing and these things. You see that the community, all the money went to this one room. And so I think, that was a pretty amazing. That was just, I would have loved to know more about that. I regret I was a lot younger, and this was before my time of like trying to document everything, but I really wish I did. I really wish I had, or maybe it's time to go back and check it out. But
that's what I was just going to tell you. Maybe it's time, now that you brought this story up, maybe it's the time, and maybe it's another book about how you go off the beaten path and find and explore and find new treasures in life and learn to appreciate things that are from the past instead of newfangled technology, newfangled cell phones. I mean, what will we do without our cell phones, of course, our technology? But to imagine just sitting down and unplugging and having a one-on-one conversation instead of a text.
Yeah. And I mean, I grew up going to museums and going to art galleries and everything. And I think that that's part of, I think when we lose that, I'm very pro arts in that way. Yeah. And when we lose that, though, that's our humanity, really.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Her time is up, and I hate this because this is such a great conversation. Tell people where they can find you at.
I'm pretty easy to find. My website's carolinetopperman.com. I mean, if you Google me, that's me. That's the person who comes up. That's me. So I do a lot on Instagram as well. I try to post a lot from when I travel to different cities and different things too. So pretty easy to find.
Pretty easy to find. I was so excited that you offered to come back on. I mean, literally, she was on months ago, and I'm so slack. And I will say this, I'm slack about sending links out when people come on, because I'm like, I've got so many. When you're a solopreneur, you've got so much stuff going on that you're like, okay, you've got to prioritize. And I'm like, finally, I'm going to get this done. But I'm so glad when you said, hey, if you ever want me to come back on, I'm like, absolutely, because I want you to come back on and talk about, because not maybe firsthand, but through your family's history what happened, and you can apply it to what's happening now. So maybe people can learn lessons from that.
Absolutely. And I will come on anytime.
Well, you have an open invitation. If you got another book coming, if you want to talk about your small press that you're doing, you want to talk about your little magazine you started on Medium or anything like that. And actually, I want to see if you would do me a little investigative work for me.
Sure.
And trying to find my grandmother, and we can talk about what you found out. And
Absolutely.
I think that would be a really cool.
Email me the information and I can definitely get that started.
Yes. All right. So thank you for coming on again and for sharing. I think I don't want this chat to end. I could chat with you all day long, but unfortunately, I think people would tune out after so long. Carolyn, thank you for coming on and for sharing again your story.
Thank you.
Okay, guys, until next time, I will leave in the show notes where you can find her as well as where you can find her book. And until next time, guys, bye.